If you were born in 98% of human history, you were poor. Not can't afford a vacation this year poor. Not rent takes half my paycheck poor. Poor in the old, brutal sense. The kind of poor where a single failed harvest meant your children didn't eat. The kind where an injury didn't set you back financially, it ended your ability to survive. Retirement wasn't a number you saved toward. Retirement was hoping your kids lived long enough to take care of you. Now here's the uncomfortable question that most people never ask. If that was the norm for thousands of years, why do we assume the middle class is permanent? Why do we talk about it like it's the natural state of a wealthy society, when history suggests it might have been a brief, fragile accident? Let's run a simple experiment. Close your eyes for a second and imagine you're about to be born. Not in 1990. Not in 1950. Just somewhere in the past. You don't get to pick your country, your parents, or your social class. The dice roll. Where do you land? Start with the Roman Empire at its peak. 50 to 60 million people lived under Roman rule. When you picture Rome, you probably see senators, generals, financiers, merchants, the names that survived in history books, the people who show up in movies. But here's the reality. Only about 15 to 20% of the empire lived in cities. Everyone else? They worked the land. You're not discussing investments near the forum. You're probably working someone else's field, hoping the harvest doesn't fail. Now aim higher. The Roman Senate had roughly 600 men, out of tens of millions. Even if you count the equestrians, provincial elites, and wealthy merchants, you're still looking at a microscopic layer at the top. The geometry of the system is the same everywhere you look. A massive base living at subsistence, a tiny commercial layer, and an extraordinarily narrow elite sitting above them. Fast forward 1,000 years. Around the year 1200, roughly 90% of Western Europeans lived in rural areas. Even by 1300, after cities and trade had expanded, it was still about 85%. Take 100 random people from medieval Europe. 85 of them are peasants, tenants, serfs, or laborers. The remaining 15 include servants, apprentices, soldiers, clergy, shopkeepers, and the urban poor. Successful merchants existed. Some became spectacularly rich, but they were a minority inside a minority. This is the pattern worth remembering. History is a pyramid with an incredibly wide base and a vanishingly narrow tip. And yet modern people suffer from what I call historical selection bias. Wealth leaves better evidence. Rich families left portraits, stone houses, contracts, account books. Poor families left almost nothing. We tour a preserved merchant's house and unconsciously imagine a town full of merchants. Nobody preserved the hut of the farm laborer who died owing rent and 3 chickens. The past looks richer than the people who actually lived in it. Here's a number that should stop you cold. Around 1820, roughly 75 to 80% of humanity still lived in what we would classify as extreme poverty. Not poor by today's standards, unable to reliably afford the basic combination of food, clothing, shelter, and each required for a minimally decent life. And don't make the mistake of assuming the remaining 20 or 25% were rich. That group includes everyone above that miserable threshold. Workers, artisans, farmers, clerks, shopkeepers, people whose lives were still brutally insecure. The genuinely wealthy occupied only the narrowest sliver at the top. There's a simple reason for all of this. Pre-industrial societies weren't just unequal. They were poor. Productivity was low. Agriculture consumed most human labor. Transportation was expensive. Energy came from animals, wood, wind, and muscle. Disease could wipe out years of progress. Population growth often absorbed any increase in food production. Rome could build aqueducts and conquer continents while millions remained near starvation. Medieval kingdoms could construct cathedrals while the people who raised the stones owned almost nothing. Humanity became extraordinarily good at creating wealthy civilizations long before it became good at creating wealthy populations. Then the Industrial Revolution changed the math. Coal multiplied available energy. Machines multiplied human productivity. Railways connected markets. For the first time, economies could generate quantities of surplus that ancient kings could barely have imagined. But here's the part they don't teach you in school. Abundance didn't immediately create a middle class. Early industrial capitalism produced colossal fortunes alongside appalling working conditions. By the late 19th century, America had Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. It also had tenements, child labor, and workers who could be replaced almost as easily as the machines beside them. Capitalism had solved one ancient problem: how to create enormous wealth. It hadn't automatically solved the second one. Who gets it? That second question was answered not by economics alone, but by catastrophe. Between 1914 and 1945, the old economic order was hit by disaster after disaster. World War I shattered empires. Inflation destroyed savings. The Great Depression wiped out businesses and fortunes. Governments defaulted. Then World War II destroyed cities, factories, and tens of millions of lives. There's nothing romantic about this. War didn't generously hand prosperity to workers. It slaughtered people. But mass catastrophe also rearranged power. Old fortunes were weakened by taxation, inflation, and physical destruction. At the same time, ordinary people became indispensable. Governments needed soldiers. Factories needed workers. Labor movements organized. Voting rights expanded. Millions of people who had once been treated as replaceable inputs suddenly had leverage, because the survival of industrial states depended on them. In the United States, economists later called part of what happened during the 1940s the Great Compression. Wage inequality fell sharply. Pay differences between occupations, educational groups, and regions narrowed. Then came 1945, and an extraordinary economic window opened. The United States emerged with its industrial base intact while Europe and Japan had to rebuild. Productivity grew rapidly. Unions were powerful. Governments invested in roads, education, housing, and social insurance. Veterans received the GI Bill. Mortgage finance expanded. In America, non-farm homeownership climbed from roughly 41% in 1940 to around 61% by 1960. In 20 years, owning a house went from being unavailable to most households to becoming a mass institution. It wasn't a golden age for everyone. Black Americans were systematically excluded from many mortgages and neighborhoods. Women faced major economic restrictions. Colonial populations were certainly not enjoying suburban prosperity. Even in 1950, roughly half of humanity still lived in extreme poverty. But, inside many Western economies, something historically extraordinary was happening. Ordinary workers were capturing a substantially larger share of rapidly rising prosperity. A worker without a university degree could plausibly support a household, build equity in a home, receive a pension, and expect his children to become richer than he was. Not everyone could, but enough could that an entire civilization began treating this historically bizarre arrangement as normal. That was the mistake. Here's the critical insight you need to hold on to. The post-war middle-class economy depended on a combination of conditions that rarely appear together. Productivity was rising rapidly. Industrial workers were difficult to replace. Unions were strong. Capital was less mobile. International competition was limited compared with today. Governments tightly controlled parts of the financial system. Top tax rates were extraordinarily high by modern standards. But more important than any single policy was the balance of power beneath them. Companies needed workers. Workers were organized. Governments had strong political reasons to make capitalism deliver for ordinary households. Then the 1972s arrived and the arrangement began to fracture. Productivity growth slowed. Germany and Japan became serious competitors. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 sent energy prices soaring. Inflation surged while unemployment remained high. The old economic consensus suddenly looked incapable of fixing stagflation. Waiting outside the establishment were economists who had spent decades arguing that governments had become too powerful, unions too protected, and markets too constrained. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, they weren't wrong about everything. Inflation was destructive. Regulation could protect incumbents. State industries could become inefficient. The post-war model had genuine weaknesses. The fight was over what would replace it. Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. Ronald Reagan followed in 1981. They didn't create the forces destabilizing the middle class, but they changed the rules under which those forces operated. Reagan's tax legislation cut the highest marginal rate from 70% to 50%, with later reforms pushing it even lower. That same year, more than 11,000 striking air traffic controllers were fired after Reagan ordered them back to work. The number mattered less than the signal. Organized labor could be confronted. Thatcher pursued privatization, restrictions on unions, and financial liberalization. Britain and America moved away from systems built partly around balancing labor and capital towards systems increasingly organized around liberating capital. Then technology and globalization made that shift far more powerful than either politician could have engineered alone. Now watch what happens next. Shipping containers slashed transportation costs. Communications became instantaneous. China opened. Eastern Europe joined global markets. Corporations learned to spread production across continents. A company that once depended on thousands of workers in one city could automate some jobs, move others abroad, and raise capital almost anywhere. Let me give you a mental model that explains everything that happened next. Imagine two people negotiating across a table. One can move his money to another continent with a few clicks. The other has a mortgage, children in school, and a job 15 minutes from home. Who has more leverage in that negotiation? Capital learned to travel. Workers largely did not. Across advanced economies, labor share of national income began trending downward from the 1980s seconds. Technology was a major cause. Global integration contributed too. Computers replaced clerical work. Robotics transformed manufacturing. Software allowed fewer workers to produce more. Now here's where this story gets uncomfortable for everyone. The world after 1980 didn't simply get worse. Extreme poverty collapsed. China lifted hundreds of millions of people into far higher living standards. Medicine improved. Technology improved. Global production made countless goods cheaper. Capitalism became extraordinarily effective at creating wealth. The harder question, the one we keep avoiding, is who would own that wealth? Look at the numbers today. The richest 10% of adults own roughly 3/4 of global wealth. The bottom half owns around 2%. Half of humanity controls roughly 2 cents of every dollar of global wealth. Zoom in further and the concentration becomes surreal. Fewer than 60,000 people in the global top 0.001% own several times more wealth than the entire poor half of the world's adults combined. Now, does that prove those fortunes were stolen? No. Wealth isn't a fixed pile of coins. Entrepreneurs can create enormous value and become enormously wealthy while making other people richer too. But pretending ownership concentration has no effect on power requires ignoring how capital actually works. A worker sells time. An owner owns something that can appreciate while he sleeps. A worker can save part of a salary. An owner can reinvest profits, borrow against assets, purchase more assets, and let compounding work. This is the part most people miss. The post-war middle class compromise mattered because ordinary households became owners too. Homes created equity. Pensions owned stocks. Small businesses built family wealth. Rising wages generated savings. But when asset prices rise much faster than wages, two people begin experiencing completely different economies. One sees an unaffordable house. Another sees an appreciating investment. One sees rent increasing. Another sees property income increasing. One watches a booming stock market that has little connection to his paycheck. Another watches his wealth compound. And this brings us to the most urgent question of our time. Artificial intelligence may accelerate the same dynamics. AI could create extraordinary productivity gains. It could make society significantly richer. But history should make us ask something before we celebrate the output numbers. Who owns the machines? Who owns the mouse? The chips, the data centers, the energy infrastructure, and the platforms collecting the profits? Because there is no law saying productivity automatically becomes middle-class prosperity. For most of history, it didn't. The middle class was not an accident because nobody built it. Governments built institutions. Workers organized. Companies invested. Families saved. Education expanded. Infrastructure spread. The accident was the extraordinary historical combination that allowed all of those forces to align at once. Old fortunes had been weakened. Industrial economies desperately needed workers. Labor was organized. Capital was less mobile. Governments feared another depression. Western leaders had watched fascism tear Europe apart and were, facing a communist superpower promising workers an alternative system. Keeping ordinary people invested in capitalism wasn't just social policy. It was geopolitics. And capitalism delivered. For several extraordinary decades. Millions of ordinary people captured enough of a growing economy to acquire something most humans had almost never possessed. Durable personal wealth and a realistic sense of economic security. Then the conditions changed. Factories moved. Machines improved. Unions weakened. Capital became global. Finance expanded. Tax systems changed. Ownership became more valuable and labor easier to replace. The middle class didn't disappear, but the bargain underneath it weakened. And that may be the stain history leaves us with. Wealth creation alone does not guarantee a middle class. Capitalism is extraordinarily good at creating wealth. It does not come with a factory-installed middle class. That requires enough opportunity, ownership, competition, institutions, and bargaining power that ordinary people can convert national prosperity into real wealth of their own. There is nothing inevitable about that arrangement. History spent thousands of years proving it. So perhaps today's concentration of wealth isn't the historical aberration we think it is. Perhaps the truly strange period was the few decades when ordinary workers gained enough economic power to claim a meaningful share of an exploding economy and then became so accustomed to the result that their children assumed this was simply how rich societies worked. The lesson isn't that the middle class is doomed. History already proved that broad prosperity can exist. The lesson is that broad prosperity does not maintain itself. A middle class is built. It depends on productivity, ownership, institutions, and power remaining in some kind of balance. And when that balance moves, the money moves with it. Maybe the mistake wasn't believing the middle class could last. Maybe the mistake was believing that once we created it, history would keep it for us. If this gave you a new perspective, here's what I want you to think about before you click away. We just traced how the middle class was built, why it worked, and what's breaking it. But there's a deeper question that changes everything we've talked about. What if the entire system of wealth we just described is built on a foundation that's already crumbling? What if the thing that made the middle class possible in the first place, the thing that gave workers leverage and forced capital to share, is about to be permanently eliminated by something we're only beginning to understand? That's the question we'll answer in the next video. And I promise you, the answer is not what you think.